Space-time relationships, architecture, film, and empathic connection. Empathy is the cognitive ability that defines our humanity, our capacity to feel another person's experience as though it were your own. Robbing ourselves and others of empathy means taking away our ability to see and understand others outside of ourselves as fully human, our quiet internal way of dehumanizing on scales small and large. We cannot love without it, and its absence from our day-to-day interactions would be utterly disruptive and shame-inducing.
We hope we're not going to lose that, that biting intervention. And I said, but to talk about love and the relationship between love and ending domination, whether we're talking about racism, homophobia, class elitism.
Now more than ever, we are in a cultural moment that requires us to embrace empathy and step away from shame-based behaviors, blaming, othering, dehumanization, and ultimately violence towards those we view as other. This project does not attempt to pose an immediate solution to these issues. Instead, it puts forth a methodology for increasing architecture's empathy-generating capacities by incorporating a filmic perspective into our work as space makers, ultimately using architecture to address the global empathy deficit.
And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting.
Empathy to film. Where does empathy come from? Or more importantly, what makes film good at generating it? For empathy to be generated in any particular encounter, some measure of vulnerability must initiate it. Film and screen narratives have a unique ability to respond to this vulnerability precursor, which engages our empathic muscle. The central 5 filmic capacities that can bring forth empathy are: number 1, the temporal element of duration, which forces us to watch a scene unfold linearly, automatically invoking a vulnerable position as we and the character both await an unknown reaction. 2 is audiovisual, the experience of those two elements as a sensory whole, and our mental synthesis of them with on-screen character experiences is ultimately what breeds understanding and empathy. 3, spatiality allows film to capture and mirror our spatial interactions more accurately, allowing us to empathize with the character's physical positioning. 4, reflexivity makes the audience aware of the constructed nature of the film, acknowledging the filmmaker's subjectivity, an act of vulnerability that creates an empathic connection between viewer and character. And finally, story is what enables us to see all shades of a character and of someone's life, and that demands that we see them in vulnerable moments, in moments of weakness. Those moments of weakness make storytelling an inherently vulnerable act, and vulnerability is a risk of emotional exposure. However, in order for an empathic connection to exist, that risk must be taken. Film to architecture. Although film has this innate capacity to generate empathy, there are limitations to our consumption of it, so I turn my attention to architecture, which has afforded this capacity for human intervention through its envelopment of us, through its relentless presence. Architecture and film have an inherent connection stemming from the fact that they are the only art forms that can operate on a spatial and temporal wavelength. They both exist in the dimension of time and spatial movement, and they conduct the same work, delineating movement, crafting a world entirely from one's imagination. There is a structurally inherited connection, as well as a shared goal, to structure social process and to stage new space-time relationships. Architecture to empathy. The techniques mentioned earlier incite speculation about how we can ultimately repurpose them for our architectural work. In the case of temporality, architecture, just like film, can control or create a heightened sense of time. Notions of slowness could aid in fostering empathy, as empathy is a practice that requires time and not an experience that we can rush. Architecture is also both an audio and visual medium. Whether at higher volumes or in a state of complete silence, sound can quickly render a spatial experience an emotional one, and create a space that could prime people for communication and empathic moments. Spatially, many emotion-generating possibilities come from measuring one's potential for movement in any particular space. Architecture also situates the numerous bodies that inhabit them and controls how they do or don't come together. Reflexivity via the medium of architecture could generate empathy in creative ways, bringing a heightened awareness to the designer's subjectivity. This provides a space of honesty and vulnerability on behalf of the designer, prompting the person engaging with that space to do the same. And finally, we can imagine an architecture of story and character, one that creates characters and allows us a chance to embody their story by physically transporting us into their life. That could allow those who engage with that space to engage with the characters' vulnerabilities and empathize with their struggles in a way that we have never done before. Empathy fights dehumanization. Through this speculative thesis, I pose that if we could engage with vulnerability consistently through the medium of architecture, it ultimately will produce more empathic reactions from us. Then, when we do face our culture's appetite for divisiveness and shame and violence, our architecture could have predisposed us to engage with those necessary empathic muscles to fight back. These imagined spaces are only the beginning. To move forward, we must allow space for these overdue conversations around shame, empathy, and love to develop in architectural discourse. Thank you so much for watching.